Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Will to Power. We are in Book 3, and we are up to Aphorism 766. Over top of this is the heading Point 2, the individual. Fundamental errors. To regard the herd as an aim instead of the individual. The herd is only a means and nothing more. But nowadays people are trying to understand the herd as they would an individual, and to confer higher rights upon it than upon isolated personalities. Terrible mistake. In addition to this, all that makes for gregariousness, such as sympathy, is regarded as the more valuable side of our natures. 767. The individual is something quite new, incapable of creating new things. He is something absolute, and all his actions are quite his own. The individual, in the end, has to seek the valuation for his actions in himself, because he has to give an individual meaning even to traditional words and notions. His interpretations of a formula is at least personal, even if he does not create the formula itself. At least, as an interpreter, he is creative. 768. The quote-unquote ego oppresses and kills. It acts like an organic cell. It is predatory and violent. It would fain regenerate itself. Pregnancy. It would fain give birth to its God and see all mankind at its feet. 769. Every living organism gropes around as far as its power permits, and overcomes all that is weaker than itself. By this means it finds pleasure in its own existence. The increasing humanity of this tendency consists in the fact that we are beginning to feel ever more subtly how difficult it is to really absorb others. While we could show ourselves power by injuring him, his will estranges him from us, and thus makes him less susceptible of being overcome. 770. The degree of resistance which has to be continually overcome in order to remain at the top is the measure of freedom, whether for individuals or for societies. Freedom being understood as positive power, as will to power. The highest form of individual freedom, of sovereignty, would, according to this, in all probability be found not 5 feet away from its opposite. That is to say, where the danger of slavery hangs over life, like 100 swords of Damocles. Let anyone go through the whole of history from this point of view. The ages when the individual reaches perfect maturity, i.e. the free ages when the classical type, sovereign man, is attained to, these were certainly not humane times. There should be no choice. Either one must be uppermost or nethermost. Like a worm, despised, annihilated, trodden upon. One must have tyrants against one in order to become a tyrant, i.e. in order to be free. It is no small advantage to have 100 swords of Damocles suspended over one. It is only thus that one learns to dance. It is only thus that one attains to any freedom in one's movements. 771. Man, more than any other animal, was originally altruistic. Hence his slow growth, child, and lofty development. Hence, too, his extraordinary and latest kind of egoism. Beasts of prey are much more individualistic. 772. A criticism of selfishness. The involuntary ingenuousness of La Rochefoucauld, who believed that he was saying something bold, liberal, and paradoxical. In his days, of course, truth in psychological matters was something that astonished people. When he said, quote, "Great souls are not those with fewer passions and more virtues than common souls, but only those with greater designs." End quote. Certainly John Stuart Mill, who calls Chamfort the noble and philosophical La Rochefoucauld of the 18th century, recognizes in him merely an astute and keen-sighted observer of all that which is the result of habitual selfishness in the human breast, and he adds, quote, "A noble spirit is unable to see the necessity of a constant observation of baseness and contemptibility, unless it were to show against what corrupting influences a lofty spirit and a noble character were able to triumph." 773. The morphology of the feelings of self. First standpoint. To what extent are sympathy or communal feelings the lower or preparatory states at a time when personal self-esteem and initiative and valuation on the part of individuals are not yet possible? Second standpoint. To what extent is the zenith of collecting self-esteem, the pride in the distinction of the clan, the feelings of inequality and a certain abhorrence of mediation, of equal rights and of reconciliation, the school for individual self-esteem? It may be this insofar as it compels the individual to represent the pride of the community. He is obliged to speak and act with tremendous self-respect, because he stands for the community, and the same holds good when the individual regards himself as the instrument or speaking tube of a godhead. Third standpoint. To what extent do these forms of impersonality invest the individual with enormous importance? Insofar as higher powers are using him as an intermediary, religious shyness towards oneself is the condition of prophets and poets. Fourth standpoint. To what extent does responsibility for a whole educate the individual in foresight and give him a severe and terrible hand, a calculating and cold heart, majesty of bearing and of action, things which he would not allow himself if he stood only for his own rights? In short, collective self-esteem is the great preparatory school for personal sovereignty. The noble caste is that which creates the heritage of this faculty. 774. The disguised forms of will to power. 1. The desire for freedom, for independence, for equilibrium, for peace, for coordination. Also that of the anchorite, the free spirit, in its lowest form, the will to live at all costs, the instinct of self-preservation. 2. Subordination, with the view of satisfying the will to power of a whole community. Submissiveness, the making of oneself indispensable and useful to him who has the power. Love, a secret path to the heart of the powerful, in order to become his master. 3. The feeling of duty, conscience, the imaginary comfort of belonging to a higher order than those who actually hold the reins of power. The acknowledgement of an order of rank which allows of judging even the more powerful self-depreciation. The discovery of new codes of morality, of which the Jews are a classical example. 775. Praise and gratitude as forms of will to power. Praise and gratitude for harvests, for good weather, victories, marriages, and peace. All festivals need a subject on which feelings can be outpoured. The desire is to make all good things that happen to one appear as though they had been done to one. People will have a donor. The same holds good of the work of art. People are not satisfied with it alone. They must praise the artist. What then is praise? It is a sort of compensation for benefits received, a sort of giving back, a manifestation of our power. For the man who praises assents to, blesses, values, judges. He arrogates to himself the right to give his consent to a thing, to be able to confer honors. An increased feeling of happiness or of liveliness is also an increased feeling of power, and it is as a result of this feeling that a man praises. It is an outcome of this feeling that he invents a donor, a subject. Gratitude is thus a revenge of a lofty kind. It is most severely exercised and demanded where equality and pride both require to be upheld, that is to say, where revenge is practiced to its fullest extent. 776. Concerning the Machiavellianism of power. The will to power appears, a. among the oppressed and slaves of all kinds, in the form of will to freedom. The mere fact of breaking loose from something seems to be an end in itself, in a religio-moral sense. One is only answerable to one's conscience, evangelical freedom, etc., etc. b. In the case of a stronger species ascending to power, in the form of the will to overpower. If this fails, then it shrinks to the will to justice, that is to say, to the will to the same measure of rights as the ruling caste possesses. C. In the case of the strongest, richest, most independent, and most courageous in the form of love humanity, of love of the people, of the gospel, of truth, of God, of pity, of self-sacrifice, etc., etc., in the form of overpowering, of deeds of capture, of imposing service on someone, of an instinctive reckoning of oneself as part of a great mass of power to which one attempts to give a direction. The hero, the prophet, the Caesar, the savior, the bellwether. The love of the sexes also belongs to this category. It will overpower something, possess it utterly, and it looks like self-abnegation. At bottom, it is only the love of one's instrument, of one's horse, the conviction that things belong to one because one is in a position to use them. Freedom, justice, love. 777. Love. Behold this love and pity of women. What could be more egoistic? And when they do sacrifice themselves and their honor or reputation, to whom do they sacrifice themselves? To the man? Is it not rather to an unbridled desire? These desires are quite as selfish, even though they may be beneficial to others and provoke gratitude. To what extent can such a hyperfotation of one valuation sanctify everything else? 778. Senses, passions. When the fear of the senses and of the passions and of the desires becomes so great as to warn us against them, it is already a symptom of weakness. Extreme measures always characterize abnormal conditions. That which is lacking here, or more precisely, that which is decaying, is the power to resist, an impulse. When one feels instinctively that one must yield, that is to say, that one must react, then it is an excellent thing to avoid opportunities, temptations. The stimulation of the senses is only a temptation insofar as those creatures are concerned whose systems are easily swayed and influenced. On the other hand, in these cases of remarkable constitutional obtuseness and hardness, strong stimuli are necessary in order to set the functions in motion. Dissipation can only be objected to in the case of one who has no right to it, and almost all passions have fallen into disrepute, thanks to those who were not strong enough to convert them to their own advantage. One should understand that passions are open to the same objection as illnesses. Yet we should not be justified in doing without illness, and still less without passions. We require the abnormal. We give life a tremendous shock by means of these great illnesses. In detail, the following should be distinguished. 1. The dominating passion, which may even bring the supremest form of health with it. In this case, the coordination of the internal system and its functions to perform one task is best attained, but this is almost a definition of health. 2. The antagonism of the passions, the double treble and multiple soul in one breast. This is very unhealthy. It is a sign of inner ruin and of disintegration, betraying and promoting an internal dualism and anarchy, unless, of course, one passion becomes master. Return to health. 3. The juxtaposition of passions without their being either opposed or united with one another. Very often transitory, and then, as soon as order is established, this condition may be a healthy one. A most interesting case of men belong to this order. The chameleons. They are not necessarily at loggerheads with themselves. They are both happy and secure. But they cannot develop. Their moods lie side by side, even though they may seem to lie far apart. They change, but they become nothing. 779. The quantitative estimate of aims and its influence upon valuing standpoint, the great and small criminal. The greatness or smallness of the aims will determine whether the doer feels respect for himself with it all, or whether he feels pusillanimous and miserable. The degree of intellectuality manifested in the means employed may likewise influence our valuation. How differently the philosophical innovator, experimenter, and man of violence stands out against robbers, barbarians, adventurers. There is a semblance of disinterestedness in the former. Finally, noble manners, bearing, courage, self-confidence, how they alter the value of that which is attained by means of them. Concerning the optics of valuation. The influence of the greatness or smallness of the aims. The influence of the intellectuality of the means. The influence of the behavior in action. The influence of success or failure. The influence of opposing forces and their value. The influence of that which is permitted and that which is forbidden. 780. The tricks by means of which actions, measures, and passions are legitimized, which from an individual standpoint are no longer good form or even in good taste. Art, which allows us to enter such strange worlds, makes them tasteful to us. Historians prove its justification in reason. Travels, exoticism, psychology, penal codes, the lunatic asylum, the criminal, sociology. Impersonality, so that as media of a collective whole we allow ourselves these passions and actions, the bar, juries, the bourgeois, the soldier, the minister, the prince, society, quote-unquote critics, make us feel that we are sacrificing something. 781. Preoccupations concerning oneself and one's eternal salvation are not expressive either of a rich or of a self-confident nature, for the latter lets all questions of eternal bliss go to the devil. It is not interested in such matters of happiness. It is all power, deeds, desires. It imposes itself upon things. It even violates things. The Christian is a romantic hypochondriac who does not stand firmly on his legs. Whenever hedonistic views come to the front, one can always presuppose the existence of pain and a certain ill-constitutedness. 782. Quote, the growing autonomy of the individual, end quote, Parisian philosophers like M. Fouillet talk of such things. They do well to study the race of sheep for a moment, for they belong to it. For heaven's sake, open your eyes, ye sociologists who deal with the future. The individual grew strong under quite opposite conditions. Ye describe the extremist weakening and impoverishment of man. Ye actually want his weakness and impoverishment, and ye apply the whole lying machinery of the old ideal in order to achieve your end. Ye are so constituted that ye actually regard your gregarious wants as an ideal. Here we are in the presence of an absolute lack of psychological honesty. 783. The two traits which characterize the modern European are apparently antagonistic individualism and the demand for equal rights. This I am at last beginning to understand. The individual is an extremely vulnerable piece of vanity. This vanity, when it is conscious of its high degree of susceptibility to pain, demands that everyone should be made equal, that the individual should only stand inter pares. But in this way a social race is depicted, in which, as a matter of fact, gifts and powers are on the whole equally distributed. The pride which would have loneliness and but have few appreciators is quite beyond comprehension. Really, great successes are only attained through the masses. Indeed, we scarcely understand yet that a mob success is in reality only a small success, because beauty belongs to the few. No morality will countenance order of rank among men, and the jurist knows nothing of a communal conscience. The principle of individualism rejects really great men, and demands the most delicate vision for, and the speediest discovery of, a talent among people who are almost equal. And inasmuch as everyone has some modicum of talent in such late and civilized cultures, and can therefore expect to receive his share of honor, there is a more general buttering up of modest merits today than there has ever been. This gives the age the appearance of unlimited justice. Its want of justice is to be found not in its unbounded hatred of tyrants and demagogues, even in the arts, but in its detestation of noble natures who scorn the praise of the many. The demand for equal rights, that is to say the privilege of sitting in judgment on everything and everybody, is anti-aristocratic. This age knows just as little concerning the absorption of the individual, of his mergence into a great type of men who do not want to be personalities. It was this that formerly constituted the distinction and zeal of many lofty natures, the greatest poets among them, or of the desire to be a polis, as in Greece, or of Jesuitism, or of the Prussian staff corps, and bureaucracy, or of apprenticeship and a continuation of the tradition of great masters, to all of which things non-social conditions and the absence of petty vanity are necessary. 784. Individualism is a modest and still unconscious form of will to power. With it, a single human unit seems to think it sufficient to free himself from the preponderating power of society, or of the state or church. He does not set himself up in opposition as a personality, but merely as a unit. He represents the right of all other individuals as against the whole. That is to say, he instinctively places himself on a level with every other unit. What he combats, he does not combat as a person, but as a representative of units against a mass. Socialism is merely an agitory measure of individualism. It recognizes the fact that in order to attain to something, men must organize themselves into a general movement, into a power. But what the socialist requires is not society as the object of the individual, but society as a means of making many individuals possible. This is the instinct of socialists, though they frequently deceive themselves on this point. Apart from this, however, in order to make their kind prevail, they are compelled to deceive others to an enormous extent. Altruistic moral preaching thus enters into the service of individual egoism, one of the most common frauds of the 19th century. Anarchy is also merely an agitory measure of socialism. With it, the socialist inspires fear. With fear, he begins to fascinate and to terrorize. But what he does above all is to draw all courageous and reckless people to his side, even in the most intellectual spheres. In spite of all this, individualism is the most modest stage of the will to power. When one has reached a certain degree of independence, one always longs for more. Separation in proportion to the degree of force. The individual is no longer content to regard himself as equal to everybody. He actually seeks for his peer. He makes himself stand out from others. Individualism is followed by a development in groups and organs. Correlative tendencies join up together and become powerfully active. Now there arise between these centers of power friction, war, a reconnoitering of the forces on either side, reciprocity, understandings, and the regulation of mutual services. Finally, there appear in order of rank. Recapitulation. 1. The individuals emancipate themselves. 2. They make war and ultimately agree concerning equal rights. Justice is made an end in itself. 3. Once this is reached, the actual differences in degrees of power begin to make themselves felt, and to a greater extent than before. The reason being that on the whole, peace is established and innumerable small centers of power begin to create differences which formerly were scarcely noticeable. Now the individuals begin to form groups. These strive after privileges and preponderance, and wars start afresh in a milder form. People demand freedom only when they have no power. Once power is obtained, a preponderance thereof is the next thing to be coveted. If this is not achieved, owing to the fact that one is still too weak for it, then justice, i.e., equality of power, becomes the object of desire. 785. The rectification of the concept egoism. When one has discovered what an error the individual is, and that every single creature represents the whole process of evolution, not alone inherited but in himself, the individual then acquires an inordinately great importance. The voice of instinct is quite right here. When this instinct tends to decline, i.e., when the individual begins to seek his worth in his services to others, one may be sure that exhaustion and degeneration have set in. An altruistic attitude of mind, when it is fundamental and free from all hypocrisy, is the instinct of creating a second value for oneself in the service of other egoists. As a rule, however, it is only apparent, a circuitous path to the preservation of one's own feelings of vitality and worth. 786. The history of moralization and demoralization. Proposition 1. There are no such things as moral actions. They are purely imaginary. Not only is it impossible to demonstrate their existence, a fact which Kant and Christianity, for instance, both acknowledged, but they are not even possible. Owing to psychological misunderstanding, a man invented an opposite to the instinctive impulses of life, and believed that a new species of instinct was thereby discovered. A primum mobile was postulated which does not exist at all. According to the valuation which gave rise to the antithesis moral and immoral, one should say, there is nothing else on earth but immoral intentions and actions. Proposition 2. The whole differentiation, moral and immoral, arises from the assumption that both moral and immoral actions are the result of a spontaneous will. In short, that such a will exists, or in other words, that moral judgments can only hold good with regard to intuitions and actions that are free. But this whole order of actions and intentions is purely imaginary. The only world to which the moral standard could be applied does not exist at all. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral action. The psychological error out of which the antithesis moral and immoral arose is selfless, unselfish, self-denying, all unreal and fantastic. A false dogmatism also clustered around the concept ego. It was regarded as atomic, and falsely opposed to a non-ego. It was also liberated from becoming and declared to belong to the sphere of being. The false materialization of the ego, this owing to the belief in individual immortality, was made an article of faith under the pressure of religio-moral discipline. According to this artificial liberation of the ego and its transference to the realm of the absolute, people thought that they had arrived at an antithesis in values which seemed quite irrefutable, the single ego and the vast non-ego. It seemed obvious that the value of the individual ego could only exist in conjunction with the vast non-ego, more particularly in the sense of being subject to it and existing only for its sake. Here, of course, the gregarious instinct determined the direction of thought. Nothing is more opposed to this instinct than the sovereignty of the individual. Supposing, however, that the ego be absolute, then its value must lie in self-negation. Thus, 1. The false emancipation of the individual as an atom. 2. The gregarious self-conceit which abhors the desire to remain an atom and regards it as hostile. 3. As a result, the overcoming of the individual by changing his aim. 4. At this point, there appeared to be actions that were self-effacing. Around these actions, a whole sphere of antitheses was fancied. 5. It was asked, in what sort of actions does man most strongly assert himself? Around these, sexuality, covetousness, lust for power, cruelty, etc., etc., hate, contempt, and anathemas were heaped. It was believed that there could be such things as selfless impulses. Everything selfish was condemned. Everything unselfish was in demand. 6. And the result was what had been done. A ban had been placed on the strongest, the most natural, yea, the only genuine impulses. Henceforward, in order that an action might be praiseworthy, there must be no trace in it of any of those genuine impulses, monstrous fraud in psychology. Every kind of self-satisfaction had to be remodeled, and made possible by means of misunderstanding and adjusting oneself sub specie boni. Conversely, that species which found its advantage in depriving mankind of its self-satisfaction, the representatives of the gregarious instincts, e.g., the priests and the philosophers, were sufficiently crafty and psychologically astute to show how selfishness ruled everywhere. The Christian conclusion from this was, everything is sin, even our virtues. Man is utterly undesirable. Selfless actions are impossible. Original sin, in short, once man had opposed his instincts to a purely imaginary world of the good, He concluded by despising himself as incapable of performing good actions. N.B. In this way, Christianity represents a step forward in the sharpening of psychological insight. La Rochefoucauld and Pascal. It perceived the essential equality of human actions, and the equality of their values, as a whole, all immoral. Now the first serious object was to rear men in whom self-seeking impulses were extinguished, priests, saints. And if people doubted that perfection was possible, they did not doubt what perfection was. The psychology of the saint and of the priest and of the good man must naturally have seemed purely phantasmagorical. The real motive of all action had been declared bad. Therefore, in order to make action still possible, deeds had to be prescribed which, though not possible, had to be declared possible and sanctified. They now honored and idealized things with as much falsity as they had previously slandered them. Inveighing against the instincts of life came to be regarded as holy and estimable. The priestly ideal was absolute chastity, absolute obedience, absolute poverty. The lay ideal, alms, pity, self-sacrifice, renunciation of the beautiful, of reasons, and of sensuality, and a dark frown for all the strong qualities that existed. An advance is made. The slandered instincts attempt to re-establish their rights. E.g., Luther's Reformation, the coarsest form of moral falsehood under the cover of evangelical freedom. They are rechristened with holy names. The calumniated instincts try to demonstrate that they are necessary in order that the virtuous instincts may be possible. Live to live for others. Egoism as a means to an end. But people go still further. They try to grant both the egoistic and altruistic impulses the right to exist, equal rights for both, from the utilitarian standpoint. People go further. They see greater utility in placing the egoistic rights before the altruistic, greater utility in the sense of more happiness for the majority, or of the elevation of mankind, etc., etc. Thus the rights of egoism begin to preponderate, but under the cloak of an extremely altruistic standpoint, the collective utility of humanity. An attempt is made to reconcile the altruistic mode of action with the natural order of things. Altruism is sought in the very roots of life. Altruism and egoism are both based upon the essence of life and nature. The disappearance of the opposition between them is dreamt of as a future possibility. Continued adaptation, it is hoped, will merge the two into one. At last it is seen that the altruistic actions are merely a species of the egoistic, and that the degree to which one loves and spends oneself is a proof of the extent of one's individual power and personality. In short, that the more evil man can be made, the better he is, and that one cannot be the one without the other. At this point, the curtain rises which concealed the monstrous fraud of the psychology that has prevailed hitherto. Results. There are only immoral intentions and actions. The so-called moral actions must be shown to be immoral. All emotions are traced to a single will, the will to power, and are called essentially equal. The concept of life, and the apparent antithesis good and evil, degrees of power in the instincts alone are expressed. A temporary order of rank is established according to which certain instincts are either controlled or enlisted in our service. Morality is justified, economically, etc. Against Proposition 2, determinism, the attempt to rescue the moral world by transferring it to the unknown. Determinism is only a manner of allowing ourselves to conjure our valuations away, once they have lost their place in a world interpreted mechanistically. Determinism must therefore be attacked and undermined at all costs, just as our right to distinguish between an absolute and phenomenal world should be disputed. 787. It is absolutely necessary to emancipate ourselves from the motives, otherwise we should not be allowed to attempt to sacrifice ourselves or to neglect ourselves. Only the innocence of becoming gives us the highest courage and the highest freedom. 788. A clean conscience must be restored to the evil man. Has this been my involuntary endeavor all the time? For I take it as the evil man who is strong. Dostoevsky's belief concerning the convicts in prison should be referred to here. 789. Our new quote-unquote freedom. What a feeling of relief there is in the thought that we emancipated spirits do not feel ourselves harnessed to any system of teleological aims. Likewise, that the concepts reward and punishment have no roots in the essence of existence. Likewise, that good and evil actions are not good or evil in themselves, but only from the point of view of the self-preservative tendencies of certain species of humanity. Likewise, that our speculations concerning pleasure and pain are not of cosmic, far less than of metaphysical importance. That form of pessimism associated with the name of Hartmann, which pledges itself to put even the pain and pleasure of existence into the balance, with its arbitrary confinement in the prison and within the bounds of pre-Copernican thought, would be something not only retrogressive but degenerate, unless it be merely a bad joke on the part of a Berliner. 790. If one is clear as to the wherefore of one's life, then the how of it can take care of itself. It is already even a sign of disbelief in the whereof and in the purpose and sense of life. In fact, it is a sign of a lack of will, when the value of pleasure and pain step into the foreground, and hedonistic and pessimistic teaching becomes prevalent. And self-abnegation, resignation, virtue, quote-unquote objectivity, may, at the very least, be signs that the most important factor is beginning to make its absence felt. 791. Hitherto there has been no German culture. It is no refutation of this assertion to say that there have been great anchorites in Germany, Goethe for instance, for these had their own culture. But it was precisely around them, as though around mighty, defiant, and isolated rocks, that the remaining spirit of Germany, as their antithesis, lay, that is to say, as a soft, swampy, slippery soil, upon which every step and every footprint of the rest of Europe made an impression and created forms. German culture was a thing devoid of character, and of almost unlimited yielding power. 792. Germany, though very rich in clever and well-informed scholars, has for some time been so excessively poor in great souls and in mighty minds, that it almost seems to have forgotten what a great soul or a mighty mind is, and today mediocre and even ill-constituted men place themselves in the market square without the suggestion of a conscience prick or a sign of embarrassment, and declare themselves great men, reformers, etc. Take the case of Eugene Düring, for instance, a really clever and well-informed scholar, but a man who betrays with almost every word he says that he has a miserably small soul, and that he is horribly tormented by narrow, envious feelings. Moreover, that it is no mighty overflowing, benevolent, and spendthrift spirit that drives him on, but only the spirit of ambition. But to be ambitious in such an age as this is much more unworthy of a philosopher than ever it was. Today, when it is the mob that rules, when it is the mob that dispenses the honors. 793. My quote-unquote future, a severe polytechnic education, conscription, so that as a rule every man of the higher classes should be an officer, whatever else he may be besides. This is the end of Part 8 of Book 3 of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.